So here we are at Macro Wonderland surrounded by flowers. Now in this video I'll show you the difference between using a dedicated macro lens compared to a standard zoom lens. This is the Sigma 105mm f2.8 and the standard zoom I have the 24-70mm. So hopefully by the end of the video you will see why that one-to-one magnification is so important when it comes to photographing small things and why micro photographers are so arrogant when it comes to macro photography. So let's go. Now, before we dive into this, I just want to mention that macro photography is one of those photographies that you just lose yourself in. So any problems that you might have with your work, with your family, with your kids, that just all goes away once you start dealing with little teeny tiny things and start to photograph, well, interesting compositions. Because let's face it, you don't need to travel to Iceland to take beautiful landscape photographs. You don't need to have access to exotic cars in order to be an interesting automotive photographer. Because with macro photography, you know, the scene is everywhere, right here. I mean, I can spend an hour over here just photographing flowers and little teeny tiny things. So let's find a little detail and photograph it and compare the two shots. Okay, this is like the opposite of what I'm actually looking for. Now for the first photograph, I'll be photographing these things over here, the teeny tiny small details on the little grasses and the little mushrooms that are growing on this tree, and these are really teeny tiny. So I'll be comparing the Sigma 24-70 zoom lens, as I said before, to the Sigma 105mm macro lens, and this is going to allow me to get really close with that magnification of 1:1. As with this one, I don't know what the magnification actually on this is. It's like 1:5, 1:10, not really sure. Now another thing that I have to mention when it comes to macro photography is the shutter speed. The shutter speed and the motion blur, which really becomes exaggerated when you're magnified. You see this right over here? This is the whole scene. This is my whole Iceland. This is my super ultra fast Ferrari, and this is the most beautiful model that you can photograph. So this is everything I need for at least about an hour, and I can photograph so many different things in just this little teeny tiny patch over here. Now with the standard zoom lens, the Sigma 24-70, I have the ability to actually get quite close because the closest focusing distance is just in front of the lens when I'm at 24mm. This is kind of a speciality of this standard zoom lens. This is why I can also, you know, get kind of almost macro looking shots, but it's never going to be the same. So let's just photograph the little droplets on this flower. If I move further away and start zooming in, then the subject is actually getting smaller. So the biggest magnification on this lens is at 24mm at the minimum focus distance. If I go to 70, I have to move so much further away that, you know, things just become smaller. The magnification then reduces. So let's switch to the 105 macro lens and see how this works. So to give you kind of an idea, this is what a macro shot looks like. So right over here, I am currently at f2.8. and I am at 1:1, so I'm at the closest point. This is now f22. As you guys can see, there's a lot more background, but the background is still blurry. I cannot get it all the way in focus, even at f22. So the depth of field is really a big thing when it comes to macro photography, because even at f22, it's still going to be very shallow. That means that focusing also becomes a big challenge. Now, if I want to have the whole flower in focus, I'm actually going to have to go to f16, for instance. But in macro photography composition, the only thing that you really have to be aware of is how the subject that is supposed to be as much in focus as you can make it, how that is blending with the background and how the background is not a distraction. So having a shallow depth of field to blur the background is actually okay, but then the subject is not going to be all in focus. So it's kind of a balance between one and the other, and having the background further away is naturally going to make it more blurry, and then you can close down the aperture and have more of the subject in focus. But these are the challenges that really kind of magnify when it comes to macro photography. Now let's take a look at this photograph, for instance, or even better, let's take a look at this one, the bee sucking on the little juices on the flower. And I know that's not a bee, I don't know what the technical word or the English word for, you know, this critter is. I suck at my job. But most of us would agree that this is a proper macro photograph. You know, the bee is just the right amount in focus, it blends with the background, and you know, you can see all of the little details. But what if I tell you that I actually shot this with a portrait lens? Now I took this photograph with a 42.5mm f1.7 micro four thirds lens, which is 85mm in full frame equivalent. And anybody who's ever tried to photograph a bee as it's flying and doing its thing, you know how hard it is. So basically I just got lucky with the shot. But the actual bee in the frame, if you can imagine this is the frame, was about this big. So what I did, I just cropped in to the subject and I got myself a macro photograph. So now some of you might argue, okay, so you've cropped in and it's not a macro photograph, but we just agreed that it was a nice macro photograph. So what changed? Now the only difference is the quality of the photograph, the resolution. I've actually shrunken a 20 megapixel image down to, I don't know, 3 or 4 megapixels. Is that really all it takes to differentiate macro from regular photography? You see, as I was taking that photograph, I didn't go through all of the challenges that macro photographers go through, and that is the shallow depth of field and the motion blur. Now, if you can imagine that the subject was this big in the frame, which was this big. Now, it was doing its thing, it was moving back and forth, and it was sucking on the juices, but that motion relative to the frame wasn't that much big of a deal. Now, if this was a proper macro shot, the subject would be filling up most of the frame, and now I have a really big thing moving all over the frame, which means that shutter speeds of 1/200, 1/400, 1/1000th of a second are necessary to actually eliminate all of the motion blur. And this way I'm losing a lot of the light. Now, to compensate for the lack of light, macro photographers typically use camera flashes or speedlights. Now, this is a traditional camera speedlight. You can have also a more dedicated macro one, but I was going to show you a demonstration as to how to photograph with this and how the images come out. But the diffuser that I have over here, typically, you know, it's supposed to be white translucent color, is now gray because it fell into some mud. So a demonstration for another video. Now, just in case you guys don't know, the magnification 1:1 on a macro lens occurs at the minimum focus distance, but you have to differentiate the minimum focus distance to the minimum working area. The minimum focus distance on any lens is the distance from the sensor plane to the closest focusing point, whereas the minimum focus area or the work area is the distance from the closest focusing point to the front element. And this is very important because if this is too short, then you will have to get really close to the subject, maybe scaring it away, and most importantly, blocking off a lot of the light. So this is where the Sigma 105 comes in handy, because the minimum working distance is about this far away. So I'm not going to be blocking a lot of the light, therefore very good. And it's also very good for portrait photography. So in order to end up with a full quality macro photograph, I have to struggle with shallow depth of fields, fast shutter speeds, and just always not having enough light. And this is why you see macro photographers saying that if it's not 1:1 magnification, you don't go through all of this trouble, so therefore it's not a macro photography process. You might end up with an image that looks like a macro image, but it's going to be lower quality and lower resolution. So if you guys have any comments or questions on this topic, please leave that down in the comment section. And if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and hit the like button. And I will leave you with this video over here so that you can stay on the channel and maybe enjoy the content a little bit more. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.